Good morning. Thanks for being here this morning, for braving the weather outside and coming in. Or maybe you were just bored at home and needed to get out. I don't know. But anyway, we're glad you're here. I was just starting to think about this particular message for this special Sunday when we got the news that Nelson Mandela had died. And probably like many of you, I read some of the articles and saw the various news clips, and was just really struck by what an incredible contribution this man made to his country and consequently to the world at large. It turns out that he was influenced a great deal by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and both of them said that they were inspired by the work of Mahatma Gandhi. It's really remarkable to think about what those three men have done to improve the way our world lives together, or at least to make a start on how that happens. Now, some tributes were out all kinds of places toward Nelson Mandela when he died, and one that I received on email was from the president of Christian Theological Seminary, Matthew Meyer Bolton. And one of the things he mentioned in his tribute was that as a child, when he was born, he had a name that got changed when he was early in school. The name, when translated, meant troublemaker. And a teacher actually gave him an English name, Nelson. But the president of the seminary who wrote this particular tribute said that if he were, in fact, a troublemaker, he was a troublemaker for justice. He stood with grace and dignity in the face of one of the greatest challenges of our last century, that of trying to preserve and create human rights for all people. And that's really remarkable, thinking what he experienced. You know, he spent 27 years in prison, and one might have expected when he came out to call for vengeance. But yet that isn't what happened. Instead, he asked for peace. When he became president of South Africa, there were those who expected him to seek reprisal against those who had committed such wrongs, and yet he didn't. Instead, he asked for forgiveness. Now, both Nelson Mandela and Martin Luther King really had a lot in common. They never ever met, but they were both working for the cause of justice and freedom in the world. They were people who spoke for nonviolence. And both of them received the Nobel Peace Prize. In fact, I read that at one point Nelson Mandela spoke to a joint session of Congress, and in it he paid tribute to King by saying the words, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last." Another of the articles read talked about the similarities between the two of them and said this: "I think both of them were moral leaders. Both were people who had very strong principles, stuck to those principles even in the face of criticisms." You see, they were together in going toward a shared vision, a vision that people could live together in harmony with all people having equal opportunity. And the only way they were able to do that kind of work was because they knew the power of forgiveness. They were able to forgive the wrongs that had happened to them. And that was a wonderful example and a wonderful gift that they have provided us by the way they lived and died in their lives. That really brings us to the whole story of the Bible passage we have this morning. Now, scholars are divided on who the author was, and I don't know that it really matters. It's a letter to the people in Ephesus, to the church in Ephesus, and the writer, if it was Paul, was trying to help them understand how they had to live together in community, some of the basic things that had to be in place for our community to exist. There were things like truthfulness and honesty and helping one another, and of course, forgiveness. And all of those had to do with the power of God's love being allowed to work in our lives. This is how the passage reads: "Be gentle with one another, sensitive. Forgive one another as quickly and thoroughly as God in Christ forgave you." Well, forgiveness was a powerful virtue that those two men had. Martin Luther King, as a preacher, of course, talked about forgiveness quite a bit, and in his own way sort of tried to define it. He said this: "Forgiveness does not mean ignoring what has been done or putting a false label on an evil act. It means rather that the evil act no longer remains as a barrier to a relationship. Forgiveness is a catalyst, creating the atmosphere necessary for a fresh start and a new beginning. It is the lifting of a burden or the canceling of a debt." Now, obviously, he understood how difficult it was to forgive, but the power of forgiveness. And interestingly enough, one of the things Martin Luther King advocated was that forgiveness was the starting point, but the ultimate goal was to really move toward reconciliation. Forgiveness is, by all extents and purposes, when you talk about a therapist or a counselor, they will tell you that it is absolutely a necessity for us to be able to forgive in order to have emotional and mental health in our lives. So we have to be able to forgive. Probably the harder task is to work toward reconciliation. And in fact, those same counselors will sometimes say to us that now may not be the time, we may need to wait. In some instances, it may be impossible to do, and sometimes it may be unwise to do. But if at all possible, to be able to move toward reconciliation, where all the ill will is gone, all of the desire for revenge is swept away. It is really astounding, the fact that Nelson Mandela and Martin Luther King were able to move toward that kind of reconciliation and to forgive those sometimes hardest to forgive, their enemies. In fact, I read a little bit about Mandela and how he got to that point in his life. One of the things I hadn't realized, and maybe you did, was that he was labeled a terrorist by his own government, by the South African government, and at one point by the United Nations as well. And when he was imprisoned in that tiny little cell in a very remote area, he began to reflect on his life, to meditate, to pray about what his life had been like, and to try to discern the best course of action to take in order to get rid of the exclusion and the hatred that existed in his country. And as a result of that, he became a totally different person. He was transformed and became one who worked for peace and reconciliation, and did that through the act of forgiveness. Martin Luther King was also one who knew a lot about forgiveness and how necessary it was in the work that he was about in his life. And at one point he said something that I think is a really powerful statement. He wrote this: "We must develop and maintain the capacity to forgive. He who is devoid of the power to forgive is devoid of the power to love. There is some good in the worst of us and some evil in the best of us. When we discover this, we are less prone to hate our enemies." You see, for the both of them to do the work for the cause that they embraced, they could not stay stuck in bitterness and in hatred that was so rampant at that time in their lives. They had to be able to forgive, to let go of it, to move forward for the greater good to happen. And that was an important step for them to realize and then to be able to do. Otherwise, none of the changes that we talk about would have come into being. Well, such is the case for someone else who was influenced by them. Her name was Millicent Hill, and she's known in her neighborhood, her urban neighborhood, as Mama Hill. Mama Hill has started a nonprofit organization out of her home where she welcomes youth from the inner city who are at high risk, who face always the challenges of homelessness or gang violence. And she has been moved to the point of being able to do that. She was inspired by her involvement in the civil rights movement. Let's take a look and see what she has to say about that. Incredible work that came about as a result of her involvement in that early civil rights movement. Well, we may be thinking, what does this have to do with me? After all, if you talk about the Nelson Mandelas of the world or the Martin Luther Kings of the world, these are extraordinary people, far above the ordinary, far above who we are. And yet I don't believe that's true. I think we all have that capacity. And let me tell you what I think it has to do with each of us. I would bet that there's at least one person here this morning, at least one, who in one way or another is harboring a grudge toward another person and who can't let go of that ill will, that sense of being so wronged, and that maybe even hatred toward another person. If that's where we happen to be, that's why we have forgiveness. We have to be able to let go of it. If there's anything like an anger that is seething within us that we can't seem to get past, we need forgiveness. We need to be able to do that. Now, I know it's quite easy to say the word forgive, but it's a lot harder to do. It really is a struggle sometimes for us to be able to forgive, and yet it's the only way. It's the gift of love, and it's the only way to move forward. I did hear that Nelson Mandela's own daughter has had a terrible time forgiving her father. She felt that because of all of his public work, that he had neglected his family and wasn't there for them, or at least in her mind wasn't there for her. And so even someone as close to him as that had a difficult time learning to forgive. So it is a challenge. It is a hard thing to do. And yet it may be the most important work we ever go about doing. Reinhold Niebuhr put it like this: forgiveness is the final form of love, and it truly is a gift of love. You see, when we forgive, we begin to understand what it means to be a human being. And as human beings, we have to acknowledge we are fallible. We make mistakes. We hurt one another. We wrong one another, sometimes deliberately, sometimes inadvertently. And when we do that, there's no other thing that works except forgiveness. Well, how do we do that? How do we begin forgiving? Well, I think first it takes a genuine desire to be rid of this horrible feeling that we have inside, the grudge we're holding against someone else. I certainly think it takes a power greater than we are to do that, and I think that means that we have to pray and have God help soften our heart and move us toward being able to forgive. And then we absolutely have to realize that our lack of ability to forgive, holding a grudge, is really hurting us. It erodes our soul. It's like poisoning to our own soul. And we have to be able to get rid of that in order to move forward in a healthy and positive way. Lewis Smedes, who's written several books about forgiveness, said this: "To forgive is to set a prisoner free and discover that the prisoner was you." Well, how will we know when we come to the point of thinking that we've really forgiven? What will be the signs? Clarissa Pinkola Estes said it this way: "How does one know if she is forgiven? You tend to feel sorrow over the circumstance instead of rage. You tend to feel sorry for the person rather than angry with him. You tend to have nothing left to say about it at all." If you happen to have been here the last Sunday of 2013, you may recall that we talked about how we, as people in the garden, could bring about a revolution in this world, what we called a love revolution, based on the work of my friend Rudy Rasmus in Houston, Texas. And one of the things we understand is that Nelson Mandela and Martin Luther King really were a part of that love revolution, probably without ever calling it that. And they were able to do that because they could forgive. If we really, truly want to be a part of this love revolution, then we have to learn to forgive.